Good afternoon. We are beginning. My name is Tetyana Filevska. I'm creative director of the Ukrainian Institute, Ukraine's public institution responsible for cultural diplomacy. We are here in Venice, beginning the second part, the second conference of the series of talks and discussions dedicated to decoloniality. This series of public events is part of Ukrainian Pavilion at the 59th International Art Exhibition of the Biennale di Venezia. This conversation is dedicated to the topic of art as a weapon and as a target. We look at this topic through the lens of decoloniality. We started this series of conversations back in April when the Biennale just opened with the panel including American historian Serhiy Blokhy, Ukrainian artist Alevtina Kahidze, co-curator of the Ukrainian Pavilion, Borys Filonenko, a director of major Ukrainian art institution, Mistecki Arsenal, Olesa Ostrovska, and the conversation was an introduction to the series. The previous event that happened a month ago here was dedicated to the theory of decoloniality and how it changed, what shifted since the full-scale invasion of Russia against Ukraine on the 24th of February. The next events will take place later in October and in mid-November. They will be dedicated to the unknown art histories and decoloniality and the biennials accordingly. So please follow our information on the program on the website of Ukrainian Institute, the Ukrainian Pavilion, and our social media. I would like to thank to our partners and the host of this event, the Biennale di Venezia, for making it possible. And the partners of this event, co-organized by the Ukrainian Institute and the National Pavilion, are the Naked Room Gallery, Open Space NGO, and International Renaissance Foundation. This particular conference will take place 2 days, today and tomorrow. It is happening in person in Venice, and it is streamed online on the Facebook page and YouTube channel of the Ukrainian Institute. So I also would like to welcome all the online people watching us online and all those who watched us as a recording. And I know that there are already thousands of views of previous recordings, and I'm expecting also a large interest from the audience to this particular conversation. And I would like to give a short overview of what the topic will be, how we will speak about our topic in the next few days. So the general idea is to discuss what is the relation between art and war. When we started this program in April, we counted days since the beginning of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Now we count months. It's been 7 months. The devastating war of Russia became the reason and main subject of this program, but we don't limit ourselves to just this particular war. Honestly, one of so many in human history, although unprecedentedly brutal and violent. And of course, there are different contexts that we can look through at our topic, but I would like to point out that besides the kind of obvious understanding of the topic, there are quite unobvious ones. We will talk about the losses of culture and heritage in wars. We will talk about art being weaponized and misused in hybrid warfare. We will talk how art can help fight back against oppression and how art system is compromised by the money from selling weapons. But I would also like to point out several aspects that I find important for this conversation. And before I summarize, I would like to give a few examples of how art and war, despite seemingly being on the opposite sides of human culture, are intertwined and interdependent. And my story begins in 2011 in Donetsk. And you can see the space of Izolyatsiya, platform for cultural initiatives, which was the first space for contemporary art in Ukraine's eastern city. On this photograph, you can see the process, the performance by a famous artist, Tsai Go-tsan, who is of Chinese origin but works in New York, who uses gunpowder as his main medium. He paints with gunpowder, trying to say that gunpowder, being an instrument of war and of weapon, can be used also for creating art. So what makes the difference is the attitude and the motivation. And after 2014, Donetsk was captured by pro-Russian troops, and Izolyatsiya was turned into a military base and a prison. You can see the same place that I showed on the previous picture, but now they use it, the Russians use it to keep weapons and tanks. This work by Kader Attia, who is this year's curator at the Berlin Biennale in 2012 in one of the basements in Izolyatsiya, it's called Ce n'est rien, there's nothing. And in 2 years, in the same space, in the same basement, Russians started torturing people and keeping them imprisoned. One of their prisoners, Stanislav Aseyev, was kept there for almost 2 years before he was released. And he wrote about his experience in a book which is called In Isolation. It's now translated in different languages. So Aseyev created basically another piece of art, another artwork, a book, a literary piece about his experience of war in the space which used to be an art space. So we have the change and intertwining of art and war twice. Many of you probably saw this image. It's a small local museum in Ivankiv, not far from Kyiv, which was burned down on the 27th of February by a Russian missile. And this is a photograph from the place next door, Giardini, in the Biennial. It's the main exhibition curated by Cecilia Alemani, and the small dot behind the elephant there is an artwork by Maria Primachenko. This artwork was actually added basically last moment before the opening, after the invasion started. And this is an exhibition that took place just a few weeks ago in Kyiv, in Ukraine. And despite the first news that all the collection of Ivankiv Museum was lost, it happened that 2 men living in this town, you can see their picture on the right, they went into the burning building and saved the paintings of Maria Primachenko, and altogether they saved 14 artworks. Almost half of them you can see here. Alevtina Kakhidze, who was already part of this program before, is an artist based in Kyiv or nearby Kyiv in Muzichi, a small village on the northwest of Kyiv. She dedicated a lot of her artworks since the invasion to unveiling propaganda and violence that is hidden and that is used by Russian culture. Alevtina draws many responses to the different events which engage Russian culture and Russian culture actors still trying to remain their positions in the international artistic system. And on this photograph, you can see Katerina Yakovlenko, a Ukrainian curator and writer and researcher, in her apartment, which was burned down in Irpin during one of the shellings. This is what remained of that apartment. And when she returned home a few months after the invasion, she created an art exhibition inviting her friends and artists who spoke about their experience of the war and of the invasion. This is Turner, the famous painting. And this is David Burlyuk, a famous artist of the first half of the 20th century, known as the father of the Russian avant-garde, but who actually comes from Kherson, which is now temporarily occupied by Russia. And this is the artwork that he created in 1921, basically 100 years ago. And this is a photograph of this morning, and when you, if you read Ukrainian and you go to the social media, it's full of news that Ukrainian armed forces are the best painters ever because they chose the best lighting to fire the Crimea Bridge. And so there are a lot of different interpretation basically dedicated to the artistic quality and the artistic essence of this act of war. Thank you so much. I just tried to give you some cases and background on the context where we have this conversation now. And I would like to invite you to invite on this stage now co-curator of the Ukrainian Pavilion of the Venice Biennale, Borys Filonenko, who is a curator and a writer and researcher from Kharkiv. Borys, please join. The floor is yours. And after Borys gives his keynote, we will have an opportunity to ask him some questions. And after that, we will turn into a wider discussion with other participants. Stay with us.
Thank you, Tetyana. Ciao tutti, dear friends, dear audience. I'm from Kharkiv. I'm 31 years old, and until 24th of February, I'm a pacifist. And today I would like to talk a little bit about art after pacifism. Since the proclamation of independence 31 years ago, Ukraine has not waged wars. And what I'd like to talk about in my speech today is in many ways a story of fundamental change. The transition from pacifism to militarism in artistic field as well, but also it's my attempt to tell that this opposition between pacifism and militarism could be better discarded as irrelevant to contemporary reality. In the very beginning, I would like to say that doves of peace are dead. In this drawing by Alevtina Kahidze, you can see two doves with the names Pacifism and Never Again, who were killed under shelling by Russian missiles in Ukraine. This work defines my speech today, namely the question of how discourse of peace and images of peace turn out today to be a delusion, a failure, a rotten statements. There is nothing worse and more senseless today than saying no war, to be for peace, and acting on basis of this abstract, old-fashioned formulas. I recall that in Ukrainian parliament, it was a party of Viktor Medvedchuk, relative of Putin, who called for peace when Crimea, Luhansk, and Donetsk regions were already occupied by Russians. I also recall Slavoj Žižek's words that pacifism is a wrong response to the war in Ukraine. But most of all, I would like to read the words of Ukrainian Minister of Foreign Affairs, Dmytro Kuleba, who shows how poisoned the word peace become today. Those who propose Ukraine to give up on its people and land presumably not to hurt Putin's bruised ego or to save Ukraine from suffering, must stop using the word peace as an euphemism to let Russians murder and rape thousands more innocent Ukrainians and grab more lands. Along with the dead doves of peace, I keep coming back to John Lennon's Imagine and Pablo Picasso's Guernica as two examples of significant artworks that have suddenly become completely irrelevant for today. I'm comparing them because in a broad sense they represent two sides of the same message, same simple message about the peace. Lennon talks about an utopia of complete mutual understanding, an utopia without war, while Picasso, on the contrary, shows that war is terrible, shows a dystopia in which everyone perishes. Today we can see how this messages about peace shrinking, and I'd like to mention that it didn't happen immediately because we know that Picasso's Guernica was quite a strong and powerful message. Once I would like to give you one example from 2003, beginning of the war in Iraq. That day, it was the 5th of February, during the presentation of United States Secretary of State Colin Powell's speech presentation about American case for war against Iraq, United Nations official decided to cover up a tapestry reproduction of Picasso's Guernica under the blue veil. And after discussion at the round table in United Nations, Powell went to the press conference in safety on a blue background, as you can see in this slide, instead of answering journalist questions next to the compromising work. It's needless to say that the blue curtain only gave Picasso's work even more impact. Hidden, this work had a stronger effect on what was happening around, especially this blue curtain at a conference, some David Lynch vibes, I think. So to make a critic of this event, the artist Goshka Matsuka did work about Colin Powell with the title The Nature of the Beast. And another plot. Today in 2022, there are protests in front of Guernica against the supply of weapons to Ukraine. And this event like this, for me, it's a new situation because activists who, in this slide, they took part in this action, not actually grasping and anti-war images offered them by the 20th century, by they are not taking a step toward a new reality, and in this reality where weapons become a necessary element for the survival and defense of huge European country in the face of colonial aggression, they choose, I think, ready-made decisions and all solutions which don't work in the face of evil, death and genocide. Also, out of inertia, not because they figure out what is happening in Ukraine, these activists write on banners such a slogan: "War is the death of people, war is the death of art." I think that by opposing art and war in this way, participants of this action not only reproduce the old-fashioned division between art and war, but also deny themselves the opportunity to see that art does not disappear during the wartime, but rather rather change in many forms, and Ukrainian artists now feel uncomfortable creating works during a hot war, but at the same time refuse to ask themselves, rarely refuse to ask themselves the radical question of what they can still do. Many Ukrainian artists are still working in this, in many ways, ethical choice to do an artwork or not to do. Therefore, the pacifists today, of their own free will, lose two opportunities at once: to see reality in its new manifestations, and also to refuse to ask themselves the question of how they can be part of this changing world without reducing art and without taking power from such works as Picasso's Guernica. I'd like to show more works by artists from Ukraine, which was made during the 7 months of war. These works do not oppose peace and war, art and war, but venture to define the complexity of these relationships between art and war, weapons and art, and questioned the peace as a concept. I'd like to remind here one another image of pacifism from the last century. Yes, this flowers against weapons. To continue with works by Pavlo Makov, artist who now represented in Ukrainian Pavilion in La Biennale, we can see that in his works, it's quite new, printed and printed works. We can see that relationships between plants and weapons they're changing in this work. Makov captured the visual and also linguistic similarity between plants and bombs. When explosions occurs, or even when a projectile just flies out of cannon, we can see a similar movement of the form, as if flower grows out of smoke. Because of this similarity, guns in the Russian war against Ukraine are sometimes called by plant names. Pion, hyacinth, cotton, also known as bavovna. So one more example of works by Pavlo Makov. In the left side, it's a bush of roses, which he left in Kharkiv when he decided to move to the Venice in the very first week of the war. And second one is like explosion. In the work by Katya Buchatska, the artist decided to dedicate her work to the newborn animals who got the names of weapons, most often Bayraktar and Javelin. Springtime, the title of this work, is a work about being born at the time of death, when weapons became the possibility of life, and because of it, many newborn animals was named by these names. In the margins, I must note that in Ukraine, the names of weapons are not only for animals. Before going to Venice this time, I went to pizzeria that had special Bayraktar and Javelin pizzas. And I thought for a while about how these characteristics of the weapons can affect the development of new pizza recipe. So weapons criticism may also appear in more contemporary way, not in the modern art way. Here you can see work by, for a public space. It's a large poster made by two authors, Ukrainian artist Anatoly Belov and Polish artist Kacper Szalecki, in which they show the number of weapons sold by the countries of European Union to Russia since 2015, when such actions were prohibited due to sanctions. And of course, this work is about responsibility for the war and trading of weapons to the country who's making aggression and terrorist actions. I would like also to mention the work by Stanislav Turina, who restored the power of a few simple words. First, thank you. Today in Ukraine, there is a huge amount of volunteer work, and the country is large, and humanitarian aids, necessary things for soldiers, require building of large systems, large supply chains, and accordingly need to reporting on the work done. So once in his Facebook page, Stanislav drew a series of such works and posted them. These works, as you can see on the screen, and wrote that these words, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, are instead of checks and reports. For me, it's a strong gesture of restoring the language of recognition and gratitude during the war. And the second simple word from another work by Stanislav Turina, it's untranslatable, I think. There is two versions of translation into English, happy day, or congratulations with the day. It's like a postcard to congratulate a new day. In fact, it's an old series of drawings from 2013, which received a new meaning after February 24, when each new day became truly new and was perceived as an event requiring, if not a holiday, then at least congratulations. And the last example, the name of Zhanna Kadyrova, also artists who were represented in the previous La Biennale, and this year it was a very beautiful exhibition, Polyanitsa here. So it's the name of artist on the rocket that will fly towards the occupying forces. It means that Zhanna actively helps the Ukrainian army, and therefore she got the opportunity to leave a message on the weapon. It seems to me that she calls to love, not to fight. I will stop here to outline the simple thesis that the links between art and war, art and weapons, are much more complex than a call for peace. I remember discussion in MoMA about helicopter, which was used in wars. I remember the text by Willem Flusser, where he described how the situation of a designer who was commissioned to make an atomic bomb, and it should be both beautiful and functional thing. So it's like a puzzle for his professional qualities. And also I recall many media series which clarify and shows how new medias are very well connected in a common history with development of military affairs. But most important for me today is that I can see different ways to take the war seriously and take the risk of construction a new language and new images of reality in the practices of Ukrainian artists who continue to work while they have to defend their country as well. I'm sure that only by such way and such resolution to be open to the reality in which there is war happening, only this way can give us even a tiny but a chance to talk again about peace. In Ukraine, we call this hope after the victory. Victory over evil, of course. Thank you. Maybe you have questions, if it's necessary. Or we can run to discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Then we will turn into our conversation, and I'm sure the questions will follow. The conversation is titled Art and War Beyond the Obvious, and I would like to introduce participants and invite them on the stage. So Borys Filonenko is already here, I already introduced him. Kuba Snopek, urban designer, an artist from Poland. Rosie Cooper, curator and director of the Wysing Art Center, which is situated outside of Cambridge, the UK. Thank you all for dedicating your time. Thank you for coming to Venice in person to talk, to think, to watch together, because at this moment, for us, at least in Ukraine, having a chance to talk and discuss something is a huge privilege given to us by our armed forces. And really not just every day is treasured, but also every opportunity to talk to colleagues is an excellent moment. When guns roar, muses are silent. Often people say, and the saying brings art and war at the opposite sides of life. It's often considered that art is a privilege of peaceful time, while war brings us down to the Maslow hierarchy of instincts, which is out of reach for the wish to self-expression. And this is what Borys just outlined in his keynote. The logic behind it is quite clear and maybe even obvious. In the strive to survive, protecting your own physical existence, we should not think of creating art which requires extra resources, spare time, and specific mindset. But history shows us the examples that speak about the opposite. And at the edge of life, people do create art, they do write poetry, and they do it often. So maybe we just don't know something about art and war. Or maybe we are used to the statement or to the explanation from a different reality than the one that we are at now and the one that we are going to face in the near future, which is not promising many peaceful times. Before we dive into the discussion and conversation, I would like to ask Kuba and Rosie to introduce a little bit their topics, their statements, and their practice. And then we'll turn into the questions and answers. So Kuba first.
Thank you. How should I change the slides? Thank you very much for the invitation. For me, it's really a privilege because we have all been extremely empathetic about what is going on in Ukraine, in Warsaw. In my 5 minutes of the statement, I would like to, let's say, introduce a little bit of the background, how I personally perceive this topic of the discussion, but also put out some questions. So this photograph that you can see is my city. It's Warsaw. It's my city of choice. I was not born there. Just after the Second World War, and it's a very famous photo. Nobody knows who this girl is. And a few years ago, when the internet appeared, there was a huge action of crowdsourcing, trying to figure out who this is. Like the whole nation was trying to find this person.
and they failed. We don't know. But you can see the ruins of the ghetto, and you can see one building that the Nazis actually left, which is a Catholic church. And I think that this perspective of, this is my personal perspective of how I see culture through urban design, and in here it's more like urban undesign, like destruction of what is the city. And I personally perceive art as part of a bigger thing, of culture that can be seen through architecture, through urban design, through photography, poetry, absolutely different elements. I think that you have very many reflections of what is actually the culture. And some questions because we are in Poland 80 years past this, and people who have lived through this are almost all dead, but it's still a point of reference, and it's still something that everybody is kind of working through, and you can't do anything without really thinking about this. So a few questions that I think are important. Can you go to, here is the second slide. One of the questions I think that after the destruction of war, there is a question: what do we take with us into the future? There is a moment of you could call it like a curatorial selection. You're selecting the objects, bigger ones, smaller ones. What would you like to take with you? And in Poland, it was a very complex, let's say, process, and also an interesting one. In here you can see, this is a well-known story of the artworks by Canaletto from the 18th century, which were recreated as architecture after the destruction of Warsaw. So the first decision was taken to actually rebuild the city. The second decision was taken to skip the 19th century. And the skipping of 19th century was because of the let's say, ideological reasons. 19th century was the age of capitalism, and it was the socialism rebuilding Warsaw. But it was also, in a weird way, coming back to Poland before the partitions, the Poland that used to be a sovereign state. But this question of what we take with us can be much more complex than this. This is a well-known story. A much less known story, this is the city of Wrocław, which was not a Polish city until 1945. It fell into Polish hands after the war. And it fell together. It was, of course, ruined, but some buildings were intact. One of these buildings that was intact was this building in the back called the Centennial Hall, which was erected by Germany 1 year before the First World War as a monument to a battle won in 1813, the Battle of Leipzig. And it was called Centennial Hall to commemorate that. And of course, this name in 1945 was impossible to use because it was commemorating the enemy winning with, let's say, us. Poland positions itself as a power that fought with Napoleon against Germany, Russians. And the funny thing is that after 80 years or after 70 years from the war, there was a huge struggle within the city of Wrocław, which is my hometown, of appropriating this culture, appropriating this architecture, actually making it your own, domesticating it, forgetting about what it is, and erasing the bad memories, let's say. And at some point, it was appropriated to that extent that the socialist name People's Hall was actually taken back into original one Centennial Hall. So today, in the Polish city of Wrocław, we actually have this object that was built to commemorate the battle, but the original name is back, which I think is an interesting way of thinking of what do you actually appropriate? How do you do that? But then there's another question which I find even more interesting. If you remember the first photo that I showed you, this is more or less the same area in Warsaw in the 60s. You can even see in the background one of the tower that you could see on the first photo. And you can see that the way how it was rebuilt is almost intentionally completely different than what used to be there. There is like nothing, like the streets are in different places, the blocks are in different places, the buildings have a different scale, everything is different. There is absolutely no connection with the old Warsaw. And the funny thing, actually, maybe on the margin, I just have to say that if I had known that you would talk about Picasso's Dove, I would have chosen a different photo of a neighborhood that's a little bit farther. There is actually a neighborhood called Koło, and Picasso visited it in 1946 and drew a dove inside of one of the apartments, and then it was forgotten and nobody knows where it is, which I think is a nice metaphor of what you were talking about. Where is the dove? I don't know. But anyways, I think that a really great paradox about this particular place on this slide, Osiedle za Żelazną Bramą, a difficult name, is the fact that many people who were, let's say, coming to Warsaw in the last half years, my friends from Ukraine, they were saying it feels old. It doesn't feel like a new neighborhood. And the reason, probably, like this is what we're trying to figure out in Poland, but the reason is that if you think about all the heritage, if you try to, let's say, make a division between what is tangible and what is intangible, the tangible part of what was Warsaw was completely destroyed. Everything that was buildings, plazas, urban plans, sculptures, big things, it was really demolished. But what was intangible, which was like local practices, the memory of the place, local stories, most importantly, I think most importantly, the connection with the dead, it was not destroyed, it actually stayed. There is, it's very difficult to show a photo of intangible heritage because it's intangible, which means it's not really photogenic. But there is this series of commemoration plaques that were created in Warsaw. They actually are put in every place where there is a known crime committed by the Nazis. And an extremely interesting thing about it is people actually still bring flowers and put candles. It's alive. So this is a place, these are places that are like scattered all over the city. They commemorate, you know, the death of people, but they are like extremely alive places. And this is a living culture. And it's one of these things that actually make it feel like it's an older place than it is. An interesting thing about what is tangible and what is intangible, people like to think about it. Tangible is what you can touch, and intangible is something that is, you know, genius loci, it's in the air. It's. I don't like to think about it this way. As an urban designer, I would say what is tangible, the tangible heritage is something that requires political power and capital. And intangible, like music, poetry, photography, these are things that require much less of that. And this is very important because then you understand who could have actually created this and that, and who could have been responsible for. One thing I wanted to say is that in Poland we have this kind of really mixed identity in terms of the colonial, decolonial thinking, because part of our identity is, of course, a nation that was colonized, but also there is a part of the identity which is the nation that was, let's say, a local power and was colonizing others and itself. And there is a huge discussion between these identities happening in Poland, and I think that tangible and intangible heritage and architecture and everything that is built and not built, these elements of culture, they're actually an important part of this discussion. So coming to the end, I would say, of course, I'm not Ukrainian, but I do have some memories from pre-war Ukraine. Having worked there for 3 years, I think I could understand what was the discussion. And one of the striking things about Polish discussion about cities is that architecture doesn't play the first role. It's not that important. Even here in Venice, the Polish pavilion during the architecture biennial is actually curated by the artists institution, not by the architects, which is something very weird for architecture biennial. And on this background, I would say that my feeling is that it's even less important in Ukraine. So maybe I'm wrong, it's just a hypothesis, but one of the things that was striking to me is that this is, of course, the House of Culture in Kharkiv, which was partially destroyed during the war, a great example of avant-garde architecture. For me, it was striking how much the discussion about built heritage is an expert discussion, and how much it does not become a discussion in the mainstream media, at least the ones that I read in Ukrainian. I think it's a very weird situation and a very interesting one. And the last photo which I wanted to show, I think it's a building also in Kharkiv, which connects all these questions that I was talking about, because in terms of, let's say, the discussion of decommunization that was happening before the war started, that I was, let's say, listening to before the war, this Stalinist or like late Stalinist building, a very imperial one, would be probably the first one to decommunize. But now, as it was destroyed, maybe some new forces were actually unleashed. Something that was yours was destroyed. Is it yours now? Is it more yours? Is it something that you feel? It's a completely different building. Once it was hit by a rocket, and there is a completely different relation between people who live in Kharkov and this building, between the people who live in Ukraine and this building. And I think for now, for me, it was let's say, the most paradoxical and the most interesting example of how, let's say, an element of culture that maybe it's like an alien one, maybe not, something that is, on the fringe, in the gray zone, actually becomes something very relevant and very important, because part of the oblast administration of the administration of the region was in there, and you have to have some stance, think about what to do with this. So I have no answers. I just wanted to lay out some questions about what I think is interesting.
Thanks, Kuba. We'll keep all the questions for later. And Rosie, please have your statement.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Hi, I'm Rosie Cooper. My pronouns are she, her. And I have some slides as well, so maybe I could use this one. Thank you. And that's the very last slide. So. This is very strange. They're in a really different order to the order that I've... Oh, really? Okay. Okay. So could you put me to the first slide? Okay, great. Thank you. Cool. Okay. Thanks. Okay, so I'm approaching the topic of the day from my firm belief in the role that cultural production plays in resistance struggles. And I'm going to talk about how this is manifested in my work as a curator and in my current project of leading an institution. So this is an image from an exhibition that I organized called Still I Rise, Feminism's Gender Resistance, Acts 1 to 3, and I co-curated it with Irene Aristazabal and Cedric Folk. It unfolded across 3 contemporary art institutions, Nottingham Contemporary, Delaware Pavilion, and Arnolfini in the UK between 2019 and 20. And we looked at the role that artists, designers, and architects played in intersectional feminist resistance movements from the 19th century to today. We looked at large-scale uprisings and much more intimate acts of resistance. It wasn't chronological. We also looked at city planning as well, actually. So we united movements and individuals across time and space, acknowledging that resistance is possible in different places and at different times. And the sort of conventional feminist wave model only works for a certain group of feminists, usually in the West. And we didn't shy away from complexity. We showed heated arguments, for example, between sex-positive and anti-porn feminists. We showed the difficulties of factions who tried to organize a cross-class divide. And but through that, we ultimately showed how inseparable the struggles for queer, trans, working class, global majority rights are, and how incredibly messy these struggles have sometimes been. History is messy because people are messy, but the past is incredibly powerful. And I think, your mention just now of the flowers that people are still laying outside memorials is really relevant here as well, because I think the past can bring us into wider community and set us side by side with people, groups, movements who wanted a similarly equitable future. I just wanted to mention two particular works from that exhibition that really sort of highlight that idea. So the banner, the large banner, is by Mary Moser, and it's a women's suffrage banner made collectively in 1908. And it bears a reworked quote from abolitionist Frederick Douglass, which is, "Who would be free herself must strike the blow." So it's really acknowledging that struggle, and resistance is sometimes violent, and that violence is something that's has manifest across resistance movements, again across time and space. And the other image on the same slide is work by Zorka Saglova, a Czech artist. And in 1969, the communist government attempted to ban Saglova from making and showing her work, but she continued in private. The following year, in 1970, she made this work, which was these photographs are a documentation of a performance that's called Laying Nappies Near Sodomir. And the work took place where she lived, at the site of a famous battle between Catholic and Hussite forces that had happened in 1420, in which 400 revolutionary Hussites, ordinary townspeople, including women and children, overcame 2,000 heavily armored cavalry. So the artist and her friends laid out around 700 cloth nappies on a grass field, referring to the local Hussite women spreading cloths on marshy fields to snag the spurs of dismounting Catholic horsemen, making them easier targets. So for Saglova, to evoke this historic moment of resistance in which the few stood up to the many had real resonance for her in the context of the oppressive regime that had attempted to prevent Saglova from pursuing her practice, and by acting in community with those around her. So I'm just briefly going to speak about, I don't know why the background of the slide is blue. Anyway, hopefully it's not too distracting. This is an image of Wysing Art Centre, where I'm currently the director. It's an 11-acre rural site. We have 20 very heavily subsidized artist studios. We run national and international artist residencies. We're very, very artist-focused. And a huge part of our project is around resource sharing. Our vision is to cultivate the freewheeling imagination. That's a vision that we developed collectively this year. I've been director for a year. And I think cultural spaces are some of the few spaces available now for the free imagination. I believe that our imaginations are colonized from a young age by what artist David Wojnarowicz has termed the pre-invented world. And in the UK, I think that we see some of this through, for example, the defunding of humanities subjects, absence of information on Britain's colonial legacy from UK curriculum at school age, and of course, the way that big business colonizes our leisure time. And I think this idea of owning the fact that cultural institutions can take this role in cultivating the freewheeling imagination is a really important statement. And, as part of this, I'm really interested, one of the things I'm working through with my team now is around how to organize without replicating oppressive power structures and dynamics. So our mission essentially is here, but the the line that I want to pick out is that we really believe that a more just world can only be achieved if everyone has equal time and space to imagine it. This is a work by an artist called Helen Kamek, they call it Idlewild, and the phrase on the billboard, which is outside our institution in 2020, was, "Can you remember the last time when you last did nothing?" Helen talks a lot about the kind of racialized nature of who gets to rest and who doesn't, whose rest is seen as productive and whose is not. But I want to, and again, one of the images is actually missing from this presentation, but I'll describe it to you. So I want to briefly return to the idea of harnessing histories into new futures. So on the left-hand side, you will imagine that there's a map which was made by climate scientists that shows an area of the UK which actually looks very similar to the area on the slide of the left, which shows rising water levels by 2050. And the fact, and on the right, it's actually roughly the same area in the medieval period. And Wysing is a little bit sort of to the south of the kind of green area. So, and this area is called the Fens. And for centuries, people who lived there in this kind of green area, it was a watery landscape. And people who lived there, they found a way to survive through sort of, you know, agricultural production that made the most of this, of the flooded landscape. In the 17th century, huge areas of land in the UK that had previously been held in common were forcibly obtained via an act of parliament. And King Charles had the idea to drain the fens and turn it into farmland. And the people of the fens, because they knew the difficulties of the landscape so well, fought incredibly hard. They mounted an incredibly successful resistance movement against the drainage of the fens and against the removal of their land. They fought longest and hardest of anyone else in the UK to keep their land, and they battled the state for about 150 years. And the British state developed ways to suppress uprisings that took place there, such as punishing a whole community for the misdeeds of one person, that were then used in Britain's international colonizing project. But an added layer of complication is that the many people who were displaced from that landscape then went on to be part of Britain's colonial project elsewhere, trying their luck overseas to make a new life. So those who were displaced then went on to displace other people. I've really been thinking a lot about this history and what our responsibility in this is in our way as a publicly funded institution that holds 11 acres of land that doesn't currently feel particularly public. We've been rethinking how to use our resources, how to share them widely, how to work in partnership with other justice organizations who are also still sort of fighting for land access and rights. And, you know, where we are is a place that reveals really clearly that land rights, access, environmentalism, disability, race, class, and gender are incredibly closely connected. So I want to really position where I'm coming from as sort of intersectional, and I think I'm going to leave it there. And thank you so much again for the invitation, and happy to answer questions when we come to the end.
Thank you, Rosie. Thank you so much. And it seems that we have three different perspectives from you and these angles towards the topic. I'm just looking forward for the discussion. Before my first question, I just wanted to share my thoughts while you were speaking, the three of you. And I still have to pass the word to Borys, but I will share my thoughts before that. We used the most used words here in these presentations were land, imagination, and the color of blue. just interesting observation. Boris, and your statement, please.
I think it will be short addition to what you said. I'll try to follow you, but also I need to say that this discussion titled Art and War Beyond the Obvious, and before discussion I thought about what is not obvious and it was not easy to decide what obvious for whom and so on. And for me, I think that the main perspective to see these connections between art and war now, from my perspective, from perspective in Ukraine, I think it is really important to try to understand an expanded field of war, not war as battlefront, not war only like something that happening in many different regions in the world, but like a kind of presenting event which very connected to the many simple actions and really crucially changing Ukrainian society now, which transforming I think every time from one news to another, and geography of Ukraine now completely changed. I think that in Kyiv now it's the first time when you can feel that people going out from the city, not going to the capital, and it's absolutely new feeling there, because many years before it was like another way of movement. And in this wider understanding of war and what we can call war processes, I would like to mention maybe three cases of artistic practices which important for me personally, and which very connected with this topic of memory of the place and this topic of the place for imagination, because I will start to tell a story of these cases. When the war just started, my friends also, and very important artists for me, Stanislav Torina and Katya Lipkind, decided to go to the psychiatric hospital to help people there, because it was too much residents in this time. Another hospitals around this was already bombed and many people was moved to the one space. And Katya and Stanislav, they're usually working as assistants to many different artists. They working with artists with Down syndrome and without, usually in their project Atelier Normalno, but this time they decided to go to this psychiatric hospital, and it was a lot of activities and these practices of dialogue with residents of this hospital. And what is important for me in like an answer to this topic of place of imagination, when it was quite impressive for me that when you ask Katya Lipkind exactly how she painting with residences, maybe there is some methods or limits of this collaboration, she's answered quite simply, and saying that at first they made an opportunity to these people to start drawing, because before the war, in different circumstances, it was impossible because they have any tools to make art. And when it just started, it became to very rich and fruitful dialogue between them, and they continue to keep relations between one another till today. What about the memory of space? There is two another examples for me. First is about performer and poet and artist Yaroslav Futimsky, who decided to, for last 4 or 5 months, I think, he going with company of his friends to the Chernihiv region, which was hardly destroyed by rockets, and once in a week or 2 times in a week he participating in cleaning up destroyed buildings, which now looks like some walls and nothing else. And for Yaroslav, this practice of cleaning up, yeah, it's like of grabbing, of it's like how he talking about it. It's like his attempt to take this land, to take this territory from the war, to give this territory new quality of life. Not in the wartime, but in a different temporality of maybe peace, I don't know. It is important for me to understand that art can switch to this volunteers movement, but still keeping this energy of artistic critique of reality, and also using art sometimes like a tool. And this third example about exhibition as a tool, about Katya Yakovlenko project, which was already mentioned by Tetyana in her presentation. You have seen this image of Katya in her burned house with some artistic items. It was a one-day exhibition, one-day show in her destroyed flat apartments. For me, it's also one of the most important projects now, because not everybody are ready to go back to their destroyed places and doing something there. It is. I had a lot of such dialogues with my closest friends about it. Yeah, that this way to make a new relationships with your place, well known to you, but now completely destroyed. It's quite not easy to understand how to act further. And maybe I will mention my partner in comics, Danil Shtangeev. We did together a short comic story about his house in Rubizhne. It's a city in the eastern part of Ukraine. It's still occupied. For Danil, it was important to understand that in a quite biological way, humans started to forget their places if they go into another ones which have similar experience on similar function. And if you know very well your own flat, your own home building, from time to time you will change this memory of place in your brain for the new experience, and the previous will be lost. So this comic was about this. So it's my 3 answers about caring, cleaning, reassembling of space. And I think it's not obvious practices which can move us further. Thank you.
Well, I think for the obvious relationship between art and war, we consider, or most consider, this statement that I already introduced, that muses keep silent when the guns roar. Yeah, so putting these 2 things on the opposite sides that never meet, when there is war, there cannot be any art. Yeah, and art can only exist when there is peace. Yeah, like this poster that you showed from Spain, saying that by giving weapons, you're actually killing art. Yeah, So this seems like the obvious position, but what we are trying to speak here about is maybe that's not so obvious anymore, or maybe it was never that obvious. It's just someone at some point created this statement, and we all believe it because it's something that we were given, you know, from the moment of education when we were little. And this is how we were all kind of raised with, and that statement keeps living in us, in our minds. So actually my first question would be, if we understand that it's not so obvious, what is the role of muses when the guns roar? What does art do when there is a conflict, when there is a war? What should it do? What is it doing? And I think Borys already answered it, but if you also already, if you want to add something more to it, please, or specify your position, your answer. Whoever wants to start.
I have just a joke about this painting of Warsaw, that it's like an argument to the realistic painting now, to take a memory from them to rebuild the cities.
But unfortunately, we don't have an example of a city rebuilt after an abstract painting to compare and see which result would be better.
Sorry for this, but we have this beautiful photo of Crimean Bridge today, which absolutely abstract in a modern way of constructivist art, and with this strong triangle moving to the center, this fire in the right side. So I think the war is very connected to avant-garde art, and for me it was many insights about this in the very few months of war, that many things in our language becoming quite similar to the poetry of 20th century. One of examples that I love so much is that when people trying to give one another some numbers of cards or some documents, and not writing them but verbalize it, it sounds like a modern poetry of Dada or some Ukrainian futuristic poetry, and these collages by cubists or futurists or Dadaists are very I know, when you look in the buildings which was destroyed, I was in some schools, for example, you see many things that are not connected one to another in a different form, that in collage or after shelling. You see some parts of lesson of history, someone portrait, here is a part of an animal from biological class, and it's everything on the one side, and it's look quite similar to what we saw in avant-garde art, and this connection between art and war is not so obvious. So.
I think that imagining that art stops when the guns begin to fire is imagining that artists aren't people in the world, and that art isn't a fundamental expression of human existence and a language of expression and articulation. And I think it's never been the case that art has stopped, ever. It's not possible. I mean, I think, of course, in some moments, it's impossible to continue as normal, but there is always a way of expression, and art's a really fundamental form of expression.
If I could build on that, I completely agree with you. So when the weapon is fired, the rest of the reality is still ongoing. One of the most striking things for me during this war is how absolutely typical everyday things become part of the war. So, like, for example, coffee drinking becomes part of the war, or friends of mine setting up an appointment to the sauna to their friend who is fighting somewhere and will have one day in Kiev. So for me, this is the fact that it doesn't actually change into something completely different is quite striking. But I think to answer your question, what should be the link between the art and war, what should be how it should be structured and what it should be about, I think it's very important to understand what the war is about. I think that every war is about something very different or a little different, but this one, in my opinion, maybe you have a different one, how I was trying to kind of understand it or explain it to myself is very much about subjectivity, and it's very much about existence or non-existence. The very rationale about this war is that Ukraine doesn't exist, and what Ukraine is trying to do is actually exist in every possible form. And probably in this context, what we're seeing, the examples that you were showing are very much about, for me, they're very much about subjectivity and existence. So to give a more universal answer to what you're asking, I think understanding if what you're saying is true, that nothing changes and humans continue to exist as they existed and they have this fundamental need for creating art, what is the art about? Well, it will definitely respond toward what the war is about.
But definitely the mode of existence or the mode of practicing art during the conflict or the wartime is different. And it's obvious in some sense, but I would like to ask my second question is, how do you think, what are the limits of art at this time of war, crisis, trauma? And I would like to refer a situation that we have in Ukraine from a different field, not from the visual arts or design or urban studies, but from cinema. And since February, all film production, fiction film production has stopped in Ukraine. And I think just maybe one or two projects were kind of finishing, wrapping up and continuing. And I think it was already a few months ago, I don't know, time flies very different now. There was a release that a film about the Bucha massacre, a fiction film about Bucha massacre is being produced. And it's being produced in Bucha. And I think it was even based on, real stories of people who maybe weren't even buried yet. And it raised a huge issue in the society, a discussion about the ethical limits of art, and a huge part of the film community was criticizing this production and this project for being super unethical and irrelevant to the context and to the situation, because you cannot make a fiction film about the tragedy while we are still actually going through it. So this is just like one of the examples when art cannot be done during the war. And there is another part of it, it's the actually, again, like if we're speaking about film or theater, for example, is the production cycle. So you are unable to complete the production cycle when you have a curfew, for example, when you have to be at home at like 10 or 11 o'clock and you cannot go out and you need to shoot like a night scene or something, which makes it completely impossible for you to work in this condition, which is a limiting condition during the wartime, but something maybe not obvious for those who don't have that experience, and something that's very urgent and very limiting for those who go through it. So how do you think, what are the limits? What are the frames that art cannot go beyond during the time of war? Sorry, I know this is not an easy one, but this is not going to be an easy conversation.
As I remember, at first this movie was very bad. so aesthetically and so on, and this ethics was much more worse because of this aesthetic part. I saw the short trailer, maybe. What I would like to say is that I think this continuation of artistic practice or temporary pause or even some manifestation of the end of artistic practice, it's everything on personal decision of artists, because I think it is always a paradox today that many artists, I can't say that every artist, but many artists live in this double situation when from the first side, from the one side, you understand that war is something total, really big event from the capital E, yeah, and it's something that changing this reality in this world absolutely, and you cannot do what you did before because this reality is already changed. But it starts in a question of this forms of artistic speech and discourses that was important before the war. But in the other hand, it's always a question of transforming subjectivity and personal practice, which usually have language instruments to continue to talk in a very similar way about change of reality as well with the changing of subjectivity. And in this point of view, this artistic language can still be the same as it was before the war, but transforming in different in some different, more thin, maybe more tiny qualities than before. Because once I had a conversation with Vyacheslav Polakov, photographer from Kherson and Lviv, and I asked him about changings in his artistic practices, and he told me that he would like to ask me the same question: what changed in my art critical and curatorial practices, and he was so sarcastic about it. He asked me if I know some artists who completely changed in this time, and I think this sarcasm is quite good position to see that many our topics, many our thoughts that was before are not so far from the war, not so far from the context of Europe and 20th century and this legacy of 20th century. And even more, I think that many artists feeling this time machine effect, that now we are not in the 21st century when war is going on. It's like we just was forced back to the 20th century, and the same questions raised up, the same methods raised again. So I think that limits are always on artists, and I don't think that war is 100% new situation. It's always contained in artistic practices in peaceful times also.
So just one, can you hear me? Yeah. Do I understand you correctly? So that if the fiction film about Bucha would be a good movie, you are fine with making it right now?
And I don't think so. I understand this ethical problem. For me, it's also not a good idea what happened, but it's this effect of this television style drama with everything that I don't like in Hollywood movies, when a movie forcing you to feel something concrete, not to understand something, but to feel very simple emotions. This movie was in this worked with this type of filmmaking, and for me it's much more worse, because you would like to take the hot topic to make your career better. I don't know what was expectations of the team of this project. So, but I can believe that artists who working with media art, who doing video art, can do something in Bucha in different circumstances, and it's can be quite okay, because they also have I think it's will be their experience and their point of view on situation, and I even know some works which was discussed a lot about this ethical moment, but maybe I will not tell anything no more. I would like to give a word to someone.
It's a really thorny issue, and I didn't know about this project, and I have so many questions about, and I'm sorry if you've mentioned some of this before, about where the director is from, whether that's the place that they lived in before, whether they know the people, what the sort of process of consultation has been, whether it's a kind of co-produced project, whether, you know, how much advice they're taking, because it seems to me like it sounds like a project that has real potential to just kind of reinscribe trauma incredibly fast. But at the same time, I mean, it doesn't sound like this is an example of that, but at the same time, I think we're all really familiar with some of the best kind of socially engaged practices, which are coming from a place of kind of collectivity, kind of, and sort of articulating a set of experiences that can be really freeing for people. But I think, you know, there are some really sort of human, qualities like sort of just respect, compassion, and care, which need to be at the heart of any type of project like this. And I also was thinking I was thinking as we were talking about, how incredibly literal it sounds like this project is, like it's the sort of TV drama Hollywood type production. And I think, you know, there's such short space of time has passed for this to be made. I mean, I think some of the sort of ethics around, the kind of real meaningful process of consultation, just quite literally letting the dust settle. It seems like this is an incredibly problematic project to me. But I think I don't necessarily, I'm not sure that I would see that necessarily as the same conversation around limits, because I think this is a sort of incredibly human question around respect and dignity. But I think that I feel nervous about imposing limits or really asking artists to do a certain job at a certain time, because I think that different artists have the possibility to articulate themselves incredibly differently with people and within certain circumstances. But I think, you know, this is really an issue around sort of dignity, respect, and really basic care.
I think I'll try to add one more point of view to answer this question. You're asking about the limits of that are, let's say, imposed on art, but I would also think about the limits that art imposes on the audience. You've mentioned many times aesthetics, and I think it's a link to the world of, let's say, art/architecture. We have had this problem with commemoration of war. Because I think that if you looked, for example, at I don't know, the competition for the Auschwitz Memorial and other important memorials, you will find out that at some point there are amazing projects that are based in, let's say, conceptual art, and there are projects that are literal and eventually end up as a monumental sculpture. And it's always the second ones that are realized at the end of the day, because the audience for the more simple aesthetics, the audience for the television aesthetics, the audience for the realism, the audience for monumental art is just much wider. And I think it's also an important thing to bear in mind that contemporary art actually requires maybe it's not that it requires, but it narrows down the audience. And a tragedy of war and similar tragedies, they actually touch everyone, everybody who simply was on this territory at the moment when it started. And I think this is also a very important thing to remember, that yes, on one hand, there are things like what should you do, what you should not do, but then there's a question of aesthetics, of the language, and who can actually understand you. And who can read this. Maybe making a Hollywood movie is not such a bad idea as compared to making an art house movie, if it actually touches upon the things which are important for a wider group of people.
So everyone has different opinion on that. That's pretty much what's happening in Ukraine as well, around basically all the issues now. My next question would be, is the role of muses, the art, change from during the war to after the war? And Kuba, you just started also talking about the commemoration, memorial. There is also this therapeutical effect. Yeah, we already spoke briefly before the public discussion. But is there something else? So, I mean, how does it change the role of art from during the war, while you're in it and going through it, to after? You're over with it, yeah, and you're kind of coping with it and with the effects of war and trauma that it brings on you. We can speak in different order. It doesn't have to be the same all the time.
I think it's many new roles for the artist now, and from the very simple but very important role to fix what's happening. Many artists just drawing or making something in different mediums to show what's happening every day, because this wartime is very intense. It's very many small but important events here which we would like to remember also, and which we are experiencing together in this collective, big collective experience. And I think that role of archive of artistic materials now has changed, because we need to archive a lot of things, and especially in February, March and April, it was like every day like a new form of life with new events and so on. I think that role of artists after the war started is really it's many roles, and I mentioned before that many artists decided to be volunteers, and now we see how this social responsibility for the war is well connected to the art and artistic practices, and I think that what I told before, that art changing this feeling of possibility of making art, and it's not an abstract question, it's a question which artists always have to themselves, and it have a different directions. I think that today artists usually has a responsibility for the relationships, and for me, back to this movie, it is important to that relationships between authors of the movie and people with whom they worked was quite terrible. But in other case, for example, of Katya Lipkind and Stanislav Turina, we can see how this connection became even more important for their artistic practices, for people with whom they work, and also for society, for civil society as well, as a new mechanism to live together. And I think this role was already important before the war, but now in many situations we see that this personal contact is very important in this war, and examples of Yaroslav Futimsky, Katya Lipkin, Stanislav Turina, it's an examples of personal contact with people who usually need to get this attention from another person, and state government have no resources to do such small things. And I think today in Ukraine, it also was before, but now in the bigger scale, we can see that everyone is responsible for one another well feelings. And for me, it was an experience of residency in this time of war 1 month, 2 months ago. It was a residency about the future, about problematic of future and problematic of this question of the future in times of war. And for first days, me and my partner Katya Buchatska, co-curator of this residency, we understood that our residents, in fact, they needed to be speakers, storytellers of their experience through the past 6 months, because many of them was divided from some processes in society. They were alone, or they worked hard, too much hard for the front line, as they're absolutely didn't believe that they will have time to be in residency for 2 weeks and maybe do nothing, maybe to take a rest, maybe to have a space to share this experience with one another. And I can see that my answer is not really clear, I think, but for me, this responsibility for the society has changed again. Art is always responsible for the society and showing some new models of co-living, but in the war, it's new forms, which was not able for them before.
Okay. Probably we will leave some time for the questions. So if you want to add something that was not yet said about war, art, imagination, land or place, or the blue color, please take this moment. Or we can just ask the audience if they have any questions. Please raise your hand. Okay, I see a hand. Can we please get some light to the hall? Yeah, thanks.
Thanks. Hi. Well, I have some maybe comments and one particular question, but not to the discussion, but one of the presentations. Well, some comments and reflections on what you've said. So maybe in the reverse order. I think that it's very difficult to talk about what muses will do after the war for us, because this after-war period hasn't started yet for Ukraine. And for the rest, not for the rest, but for the, I don't know, for some amount of people, it is very problematic because the meaning of the word after war is very different, because for Western Europe it would be, I think, the after war after the 1945, but for some European parts it would be 2008 and 1996 and quite different things. And there it leads to my thought that Ukrainian artists too, and I think it would be great to reflect on the thing that a lot of artists are now thinking how their experience and how their practices changed since February 24th, or how they didn't change. Yes, they're being sarcastic about these questions, but still all the conversations, or maybe the vast majority of these conversations, are taking place as if there was no war before 24th of February in Ukraine, but it was. And I think even if in our, me personally, I do this all the time, I kind of, in my personal conversations, I kind of say, oh, before the war, before the 24th of February, but it is not before the war. The war started, I don't know, on the 6th of March, maybe when the Crimea was, the occupation of Crimea started. Maybe this is the start of the war. I don't know actually if we have this exact date of start. So I think, and is there a peaceful time? Was there a peaceful time for the earth, for the people on earth before March 6, 2014? It wasn't. There was Syria, there were different kinds of wars in Africa and something. And are we reflecting on that, talking about it? Are we in Ukraine also conscious about it enough? Because I think, well, the war is a very traumatizing and a very isolating experience. You think that your experience is a unique one, when in a way it is, because it's yours and you are a very unique snowflake, but in a way it is not. And this paradox actually is very, I think could be very fruitful for different discussions. And maybe it could be, I don't know, it's not a question obviously, but I have a question about these, to Kuba, about the new area built in instead of the ghetto in Warsaw. Who lived there? Who inhabited this area? And in terms of speaking about the heritage that we cannot touch. Yes, maybe it's not only about the connection to the dead, but the connection to the live people, and who inhabited this area. And how did they live? Maybe the way they lived, the way they interacted between themselves actually provided this memory and this specific type of living in this area, or maybe who lived there?
So pre-war, pre-war again. It's a good. It's actually a good term to discuss what pre-war means. It's one of the things that now we have. People say around 500,000 Ukrainian refugees in Warsaw, which made the war, made Warsaw 25% bigger in a few months. And there is always a question: what does pre-war mean? Because in Polish language, pre-war has a very qualitative description to it. If you say this is a pre-war apartment, you mean it's a good one. Or it's like a pre-war furniture, you mean it's a quality. It's not like from the communist times. So it's quite confusing. But pre-Second World War, Warsaw was an extremely multi-ethnic city. And I think I was reading a book about Gdynia, a different Polish city, and there was a statistics that in 1918 there was, I think, 30% of Poles only. I'm just quoting it from memory, but it was a very low number of Polish people. And between the Second World War and more or less now, Poland was a very mono-ethnic country. And now I think that we're coming back, the last 10 years, we have been coming back to the natural state of affairs where there's many nations or many ethnicities and nationalities. And after the war, of course, it was not only the ghetto that was destroyed, it was the whole center of the city. And it was, there were many, let's say, ideas whom to put there, but of course, vast majority of people who were living in the center after rebuilding were Poles. And I think an important part of the answer to your question is that until the 1990s, there was not so much of the discussion of the trauma. And starting from the 1990s, there started a huge discussion in the art world, but not only in the art world, also in the architecture world and other worlds, about what happened to the Jews, about what happened to the multi-ethnic past, who are we, what happened to this whole neighborhood. And I think an interesting part is that during this discussion, small elements of this identity, pre-war identity, were kind of created back and taken by the people who are inhabiting these places. I have shown you the photo from Wrocław, where parts of the German past were kind of inherited or taken. But in Krakow or in Warsaw, you can also see elements of the Jewish past being incorporated, appropriated. I think it's a really interesting process, and now we are in one of the most dramatic moments of this process. I think, of course, we are focused here on what war does to Ukraine, but what war does to Poland is also extreme. It's not as extreme because of the destruction, but it's more extreme because of maybe not building bridges between two countries. Maybe it's not a good pun for today, but actually there was such a huge number of people from Ukraine coming, and there was such a huge number of people in Poland that were open to, getting to know them, that I think that it creates a completely different, maybe, society. This is something that is happening right now, and this kind of friendship that is appearing is something that I think that we will only understand in the matter of the next maybe 5-10 years. We will only kind of make sense of this process that's happening right now.
Maybe solidarity is the right word for this relationship.
No. I think it's friendship. We've been discussing it actually with artist friends from Ukraine, and we understood that solidarity now is in Poland, it always used to be a word that was overused because of the solidarity movement. Now it's also being used in the art world a lot. But I think that our collective discussion behind the beer table ended up with a conclusion that probably friendship is a good word. It's something completely different. Some of things are shared between these two, let's say, emotions. But from the inside, at least, it looks like the beginning of a friendship, or maybe some next episode of a friendship that already existed. I don't know.
Yeah, and it's worth mentioning that before the invasion started, there was quite a lot of tension between Poles and Ukrainians regarding our common past and the difficulties actually reading this past. And I think it all kind of disappeared from the agenda since February. And I just wanted to make a small remark that according to international law, people from Ukraine who moved outside from the 24th of February are not considered refugees. They are temporary displaced people or people running away from the war, because refugees, those who are not coming back to their homeland, and Ukrainians are coming back.
In Poland, there was a big question and discussion how to actually call people from Ukraine. There was, of course, let's say there was a reflection at some point that refugees is not the best word. Then there was a reflection that maybe we should call Ukrainians new neighbors, but it was also criticized. And I think that, I don't remember what was the consensus at the end, but it was something around like new citizens of Warsaw, or, you know, our new friends, or something like this. So there was a discussion about this. It was quite long, and I think around March or April, the consensus was that new neighbors is a good word. But then it was changed again, and it was not the perfect one, because of what you were saying, that neighbors is somebody who is to stay for forever, and we don't know actually. The word refugees was also criticized for the fact that it doesn't give enough subjectivity to the people who come. So I think it's still an open question, how you want to call yourselves and how you want to call your people that come to your city, and it very much also depends on what are their plans for the future. I was looking at I love looking at statistics, actually. There was a statistics about what are actually the plans of Ukrainians living in Warsaw. And according to these statistics, I looked at them 2 months ago, 1/3 was planning to stay, 1/3 was planning to come back to Ukraine, and 1/3 was planning to go to the Western Europe, which was quite striking, that the division of the answers in these polls were so well distributed, or so evenly distributed.
Thanks. We actually have like 5 minutes to complete the conversation, so maybe one short question or short comment, if there is any, from any sides. If not, I would like to thank you for the conversation, for your inputs, and for the audience for listening and being active participant. We will have a short break right now, let's say 10 to 15 minutes, and then afterwards we will come back here and online as well, and we will watch a work in progress, a film by Furqat Palvanzadeh. It is dealing about decoloniality and art and war, but we will present it after the break, so come back to us, and thank you. From the break, and next in our program for today, we'll see a premiere. It's the first public screening of the work, which is still in progress, but we will already be able to see the first sketch, the first way of this film. And I would like to introduce to the stage the author of the film, Furqat Palvanzadeh, who is the curator and the researcher and a filmmaker, and he created this film, and he will introduce it briefly to you. After the screening, please stay. We'll have a Q&A session, and you will be able to talk to Furkat about your impressions, your thoughts, and ask questions.
Thank you, Tetyana. Thanks a lot. First of all, I'd like to thank Ukrainian Institute and Ukrainian Pavilion for hosting this program, for inviting me. It's a huge honor and a privilege to be able to be here and to show this film. But more than that, to be co-present with my Ukrainian colleagues and to show my support in this very dark and obscure and tragic times. So yes, this film, I started this project 2 years ago. And the starting point for my research was a beautiful Persian miniature depicting a game of polo. And I never realized, although if you pause a bit and think, you realize that this game should come from Persia or maybe India, at least if you think about it. But then, nowadays it's perceived as a form of entertainment, rather bizarre and maybe innocent for white privileged people. And I had this obsession that it's a great way to tell the story of colonial wars through this game. And I started this research. And then I started digging into this specific miniature and the manuscript, and found lots of very weird stories connected to this manuscript. Well, first of all, it's kept in a Russian library in St. Petersburg, and then there is obvious investigation of how this artifact ended up in St. Petersburg. Then there is the textual layer. This manuscript contains a Persian poem, a Sufi poem depicting ecstatic states connected to polo. And then I found a story, very weird story, that in the 90s there was a robbery, and there was a guy who was convicted of this crime, and he, according to the court's decision, he was basically convicted for robbing the library, and one of the manuscripts that he stole was this specific manuscript, etc. And so I tried to collect all of the stories and put it in this film. So let's watch it, and if you have any questions, I'd love to discuss. Thank you so much.
Furkat, thank you for having this opportunity to see it for the first time in public on a bigger screen. I have seen it before, but it was a different experience now. And what are your feelings about seeing it and sharing it with the others?
Well, because I'm so deep into this project, I was mostly focusing on tiny details that still we need to fix them. Yeah, it's a very interesting experience to watch it on the big screen, because I usually before that I was working on smaller screens and settings. So yeah, it's a completely different situation, I think. But also now I felt a bit uncomfortable with the Russian language. I don't know why. Before that, I wasn't thinking about it. But actually, when I showed it to my friend in Azerbaijan, and he also mentioned that, he said, both Persian and Russian for us is like two imperial languages, and talking about like a very important manuscript for Azerbaijan, and using those two languages, maybe it's not really a good thing to do. So I should maybe reconsider it, and maybe I was thinking in this conversation, we thought that maybe it is a good thing to work on different voiceovers and prepare different versions of film depending on the situation, or very specific situation where you are presenting it. So maybe it's a good idea. What else? I felt, well, there are other technical stuff which is not really important for the conversation.
Yeah, I actually wanted to ask you about the languages, because I think it's a lot about the language in the film, and we know how the language actually bears this imperial experience, and it's really important to be cautious and reflect on the language. And you speak about the notions of words in the film a lot, but what was behind your decision to pick these particular 3 languages?
Yep. Well, first of all, the original text in the manuscript, it's a Persian text. But then when you dig into the history of this specific artifact and to the context, and to talk, when you talk to different scholars, for instance, who are researching this specific period, historic period, then, for instance, even this fact sometimes is contested. So they say that the ruling dynasty and this young Persian prince who made the calligraphy, for instance, for Azerbaijani people, he was part of their heritage. So they think that this specific dynasty was Turkic and Azerbaijani dynasty. So even though they were writing in Persian, that doesn't mean that it's part of, you cannot presume that it's part of Persian culture. So it's a stretch for them. So yeah, I chose this language because the original text was written in Persian. And of course, Sufi poetry in general was mostly written in Persian. And the other language, Russian, because of this connection with the specific history of this manuscript, it's kept in St. Petersburg. And other storylines which are somehow connected to this manuscript are also Russian. Of course, one of my native languages is Russian, so it's my second native language. And for me, it's only natural to work with this language. Yeah, of course, with this war and with this whole discussion about decoloniality, etc., we are reconsidering these questions. And I had some evolution with this topic, because at first I had this urge to improve my first native language, to start writing in Uzbek, etc. But then also, at some point, I had this thought that I don't really want to. I think I should reclaim Russian language as well, because it's part of my identity. So I don't want to just give up and say that it belongs to, I don't know, Moscow. I think that Tashkent, my native city, for instance, historically it was bilingual, and during the Soviet times it was very multi-ethnic and international. And the majority of the city was Russian-speaking, and it's still like this now. So it's my home city, and I think it's an important part of my identity as well. So I think I shouldn't be abandoning it. So the conclusion was that I should be using both languages, depending on the context, of course. Yeah.
And for me, it reads that the three languages you're using are the three imperial languages, or languages of imperial powers.
Exactly, yeah.
And it's also a statement. I mean, it sounds like one. You're still working on the film. What is the development? What are you working on, and what the final film will look like?
Yeah. So I showed it to my friends in Azerbaijan and then to my friends in Armenia, because for me, this storyline with Karabakh was, for me, it was a surprise. I wasn't planning to do anything about war, but it just happened, and became a very important part of this film. I showed it to my Armenian friends, and of course they said that you are missing our perspective as well. Of course, it's impossible to introduce all of the perspectives, but I think it would be a good thing to do, to at least to try to document, not even articulate, but at least to try to document and somehow try to visualize this situation from the Armenian side. So I think I will go there next year in spring, and there is one village which fascinates me. It's a village of Pehlavans. If you have noticed, there's one frame in this film with a tightrope walking, and I want to visit this village and try to film the life there, and also write down my observations and somehow include this Armenian side from this not really direct kind of angle, not really direct situation connected to Karabakh, but from very unexpected kind of like element or part of the story. So yeah. And then this commentary, which is present in the film, I will develop it into a more kind of a curated conversation. Let's say like this. I have two colleagues. One of them, he comes from Iran, and the other one is a scholar studying Persian cultures. And I want to organize a meeting with them and to work on this specific poem, read it, translate it. It's a very hallucinatory poem. It's a very weird poem. So it's when it was discovered by the West, they used it as a reference for saying that Persian people or Muslim people are weak and perverted, etc., because this poem contains very almost direct homoerotic allusions in it. So it was used by Western Orientalists as a way of portraying East as a underdeveloped or uncivilized societies in the early 20s, etc. So it has also lots of contexts with this specific poem. So I would love to talk a bit more about those contexts. Yeah.
The last one from me, and we'll go to the audience. Any ideas on where the manuscript can be?
It's still in St. Petersburg, so they stole it, but the collection was then found.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's not that didn't disappear. Yeah.
And that's just one copy, so there are no other copies.
Yeah. It was a very important. Again, I can briefly explain the context. So this specific dynasty, which is now by Azerbaijani people presumed as an Azerbaijani dynasty, Safavids. They basically introduced this culture of Chaugan or polo. And because this poem was focused on polo for this dynasty, this poem became very important. So they created like different copies of this manuscript in different forms. But this specific copy, this specific version is one of the most valuable ones because the king Tahmasp first himself participated in the creation, and then presumably the master miniaturist Birzot, a very important author, participated in drawing the miniature, so it's like very valuable piece of art. But it's kept, of course, in St. Petersburg, yeah, that's it.
I think it should be claimed back.
Well, it's a big discussion. Well, I mentioned that there is this anecdote that this Russian general sort of left some money there when he was bringing this collection. And in international law, it means that they paid money. It cannot be proven. I mean, it's still an anecdote, but I think they use it as a pretext for keeping it in Russia, saying that the generals paid money for that. So it was not a looted library. So hopefully at some point they will bring it back, of course, because it's a tragedy for the whole, not only for Azerbaijan, not only for Iran, but for the whole region, that all of the precious pieces of art, they are like kept in the Western collections. Yeah, not only in Russia, of course, in Great Britain, in the US. So yeah.
Many things we have in common. Yeah, a lot of Ukrainian artifacts important are also kept elsewhere outside the country. Now it's the time for questions from the audience. Can we please have some light in the auditorium? And please raise your hands to ask a question and speak when you have the microphone.
Thanks, it's me again. Okay, so I have two questions, one maybe personal. What was your first urge to dive deeper into this story, into this, I don't know, definition of ecstasy, into this miniature? Is this why? So what was the first your point of interest? And the second one is more practical. How did you choose the music for this film, and how did you decide that the music should add up something to this to the structure of the film and to its, I don't know, to its mood, and what has to be specific about the music that you chose it? Thank you.
Yeah, with my obsession with this specific manuscript. Well, first of all, there's just this idea which would not let me go, that it's like this potential in this story, and I was like hesitating whether I should do it or not, and then time goes and you're still obsessed with this idea. As an author, I think it's an important thing when you are obsessed with an idea, so maybe you should just go for it. And then one important exercise was we call it, not we, but it's called Imploded Project. So basically what you do is you pick a very specific object, and then you sit and write down, unpack it onto many different layers, historical, ideological, symbolic, mythological, logistical, labor level, etc. So when I did that, I just was really, I fell in love with this story. So maybe it sounds a bit naive, but then of course there is this pragmaticism, like what idea of how do you put this specific work, how do you see this specific work in the context of maybe next 10 years of my practice. And when I tried to predict my other film projects or plan them, I just realized that there is something very common in all of those ideas. And maybe I should start with this one and then continue it. And then I see that there is something common in this approach, and I was really happy that when I saw that my own kind of a language and style is being formed through this work, because it's my first film. So yeah, there's like a very kind of a sort of a naive on one hand, and then also kind of a projecting your future. Like those two questions made me dive into this project. Yeah, I think so. With music, I think it was a bit spontaneous. In the intro part, I was a bit confused which music I should be using, and by coincidence again, like there are lots of coincidences in this project. I found a very interesting lecture by Eckhart Tolle. It's the guy whose voiceover is there present. Is like this Western guru, very important kind of spiritual influencer, a very funny persona, I think. But I fell in love with his lecture, and in this lecture there are very tiny sound elements that I also introduced in this film. And then in the beginning, we used the special lenses when we were filming the game, and I had this feeling of kind of a reversed film, and I wanted to keep it, keep this feeling as well in the music of this kind of a reversed sequence. And then other parts, it's just, to be honest, it's a bit like spontaneous decision making, and I think I will revise at some point. I started, the first exercise that I did was I just randomly picked one of my favorite tracks by Hélène Radic, and it just worked somehow, and I kept it in this version as well. So it was like 10 or 15 exercises that I did, and some of the decisions that worked are here in this film. So yeah, I'm not sure that this method is makes sense, or maybe it's too naive, but I had to trust to trust my intuition. Yeah.
Any other questions? Do you play polo? Have you ever tried?
Not yet, yeah, but next year I will try, yeah, in Azerbaijan, yeah.
Anything else you want to add, to say about this film or the screening?
Well,
speak more tomorrow.
Yeah,
of
we'll
course.
speak more tomorrow. With this film, again, thank you so much for inviting. It's an honor to be here and presenting this film. It also motivates me to continue this project, and inshallah next year I will finish it. Yeah, that's it.
Hope to see it. Thank you so much. And with this, we end the first day of the conference, and we will continue tomorrow. Just a reminder that we also streamed the film online together with the Q&A, and it will stay for a few days online, so people will be able to see it in the next days, and then we will take it from the internet because of the copyright issues. So tomorrow we'll meet again. We will have a screening of a Ukrainian film, Peace and Tranquility, only for those who will be visiting in person. We will not be able to stream it online. And then we will continue with a lecture keynote by Daria Badior, Ukrainian art critic, writer. And then we will have a discussion afterwards to develop further our topic about art as a weapon and as a target. Thank you, have a good evening, and see you all tomorrow.